18 minutes. That's all it took for 146 people to die. Most of them were women. Many were girls. Some were still children, 14 years old. The oldest was 43. None of them were old enough to understand what was happening until it was already too late. From the street below, people first looked up because of the smoke. Then they heard the screaming. Then they saw the windows break. At first, no one understood what they were seeing. Shapes appeared in the air, dark against the sky, falling too fast to be accidents. Then it became clear what was happening. A reporter nearby realized something was terribly wrong, not from chaos or screams, but from a sound he could not place at first. It wasn't a crash, it wasn't a cry. He later said it seemed to leave no echo at all. In the confusion of those moments, he began to count. There was no time to think, no chance for rescue. Firefighters rushed to the scene and deployed life nets, hoping, against reason, that they might help someone, anyone. But the distance was too great. The attempts failed almost immediately. For 18 minutes, the sky kept releasing people. Those trapped above were left with no escape. The fire closed in, exits gone, options exhausted. Faced with an impossible choice, many acted before the flames could reach them. This is the story of how a $5,000 sprinkler system that was never installed and doors locked to prevent theft killed 146 people, and why it took those deaths to create the workplace safety laws that protect American workers today. At 4:40 p.m. on March 25, 1911, fire broke out inside a scrap bin at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. The bin held hundreds of pounds of fabric waste, dry, oily, and untouched for 2 months. It ignited instantly. The factory sat atop the Ash Building at 23 to 29 Washington Place, 135 feet above the street. Workers had 4 ways out. One was a rear fire escape, supposed to run all the way to the ground. It didn't. It ended at a second-floor skylight, a flaw documented during construction in 1900 and then ignored. Within 5 minutes of the fire reaching full force, the escape failed. Those who tried to use it had nowhere to go. The second escape route, one of 2 narrow stairways, was quickly overtaken by flames. The third was a locked door on the 9th floor. For those trapped above, no safe path remained. That locked door killed Margaret Schwartz. After the fire, investigators recovered the handle. The bolt was still engaged. Survivors later testified they tried to open it again and again until the heat forced them back. To understand why 146 people died in 18 minutes, you first have to understand what Triangle was and how its success shaped the building it occupied. This is why the backstory matters. At the time, New York women had an appetite for women's shirtwaists, the fashionable blouses that replaced Victorian corsets as the Gibson girl look took over. Demand exploded. Triangle rushed to meet that need with supply. From a business perspective, Triangle Shirtwaist had found a winner. The company specialized in mass-producing these blouses, turning fashion trends into a reliable, fast-moving product. By 1911, Triangle had become the largest shirtwaist manufacturer in New York City, churning out more than 1,000 garments a day and pulling in roughly $1 million in annual sales. Efficient, prosperous, modern, and quietly accumulating risk. Success didn't just make Triangle profitable, it shaped the building itself. Every decision, where the factory sat, how high it rose, how people moved inside it, was optimized for efficiency, speed, and control. Safety was never part of the equation. Max Planck and Isaac Harris owned the company, 2 Jewish immigrants from Russia who arrived in America in the early 1890s and rose fast enough to earn the nickname the Shirtwaist Kings. Their factory occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building in Greenwich Village, just east of Washington Square Park. The 10-story structure stood exactly 135 feet tall, deliberately kept just under the 150-foot threshold that would have triggered stricter fire codes. On paper, the building was modern, fireproof, and safe. In reality, fireproof meant something very specific and very misleading. Marketing materials called the building fireproof, but that designation applied only to the iron and steel structure itself, not to the highly flammable fabric, tissue paper patterns, and wooden tables inside. No sprinkler system existed in the building because owner Joseph Ash refused to spend $5,000 on his $400,000 building. To make things worse, there was only a single fire escape that ended at a second-floor skylight instead of reaching the ground, a construction flaw that got noted but never fixed. Fire hoses throughout the building had rotted and wouldn't function. All of that made the fire possible. What followed made escape impossible. Blank and Harris locked exit doors to prevent workers from stealing fabric or taking unauthorized breaks, required bag searches when workers left, and fined employees for talking, pausing work, or spending too long in the bathroom. Fire prevention expert P.J. McKeon inspected Triangle in 1909 and found the Washington Place door usually kept locked. He recommended fire drills and suggested the owners contact experts to implement them, but the owners never responded to Porter's letter. This is where this story stops being about chance. Workers had explicitly warned the Triangle fire was going to happen, which makes it less of an accident waiting to happen and more of a tragedy actively ignored. Between November 1909 and February 1910, Triangle workers joined what became known as the Uprising of the 20,000, a strike of shirtwaist workers across New York with specific demands for unlocked doors during working hours, better fire escapes, and safer working conditions. What began as a stand for better conditions ended brutally for the strikers. Blank and Harris ranked among the most hostile factory owners during that strike. They hired thugs to beat strikers and bribed police to arrest picketers. And when the strike ended in February 1910, Triangle stood among the few factories that refused to sign a union contract. The doors stayed locked. Warning signs appeared everywhere. Triangle's own factory had been scorched twice in 1902, and Blank and Harris's previous company, Diamond Waste, burned twice more in 1907 and 1910. The fire history wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern. When the fire fatefully ignited, it entered a structure perfectly designed to let it spread. 3 specific factors made this disaster inevitable. This is important. The first was accumulated fuel. Bins under the cutting tables held hundreds of pounds of fabric scraps, highly flammable waste that hadn't been cleared in 2 months, while tissue paper patterns hung from the ceiling throughout the workspace. The second factor was no early warning system. No audible fire alarm existed, and no method existed to alert workers on different floors simultaneously. When fire broke out on the 8th floor at approximately 4:40 p.m., the bookkeeper could telephone the 10th floor to warn them, but had no way to warn the 9th floor. Their first warning was flames. The third factor was blocked escape routes. Flames blocked one stairway completely, and a lock secured the other at the Washington Place door. So far, the focus has been on steel, doors, and decisions. Now it shifts to the people trapped inside them. Approximately 500 workers staffed the factory, and the vast majority were young women and girls who'd recently immigrated from Italy and Eastern Europe, particularly Russia and Poland. Many were Jewish, many were Italian, most had little formal education and poor command of English. Ages ranged from 14 to the early 40s, with most workers falling between 14 and 23 years old. Working conditions punished them. Standard hours ran 52 per week, 9 hours daily on weekdays and 7 on Saturdays, though during busy seasons, workers reported shifts stretching to 12 or 14 hours. From the worker's perspective, the work extracted as much value as it could. Wages sat between $7 and $12 per week, barely enough to subsist, and young girls sometimes earned as little as $3 weekly. Arriving late meant docked wages, and some workers were required to provide their own needles, thread, and even sewing machines. The physical workspace stayed cramped with rows of packed sewing machines, cutting tables, and oil-soaked fabric scraps. These were the people who'd gone on strike demanding safer conditions. These were the people whose demands got ignored. These were the people who would pay the price. Something shifted. At approximately 4:40 p.m. on Saturday, March 25, 1911, fire flared up in a scrap bin under a cutter's table at the northeast corner of the 8th floor. The bin exploded into flame. Tissue paper patterns hanging from the ceiling ignited and floated through the air, spreading flames rapidly across the workspace. And when workers tried to use the fire hoses, they discovered the hoses were rotted through and useless. This is when the chaos really starts. When John Mooney, a passerby, saw flames at 4:45 p.m. and pulled alarm box 289. Mounted police officer James Meehan rushed into the building and ran up the stairs, directing women down and forcing open a locked door on the 8th floor. Managers on the 10th floor received the telephone warning and evacuated to the roof, and owners Max Blank and Isaac Harris escaped with them, completely unharmed. Silence follows. No warning reached the 9th floor. Workers on that floor suddenly found themselves trapped. Flames blocked the Green Street stairway, and multiple survivors later gave testimony that the Washington Place door was locked, that they twisted the handle desperately but couldn't get it to move. The fire escape became their only hope. Workers crowded onto the narrow iron platform, which failed under the strain. Those who were standing there fell into the courtyard. Courage bought time, but could not overcome physical limits. Elevator operators made heroic repeated trips and saved at least 150 people, but the elevator tracks eventually warped from the heat. Engine Company 72 arrived within 2 minutes of the alarm, but their tallest ladder reached only the 6th floor, approximately 30 feet below the trapped workers on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. Firefighters quickly switched tactics and deployed life nets, but the distance was too great for them to be effective. As the situation worsened, rescue efforts had to be pulled back for safety. Between approximately 4:45 and 5 o'clock, people trapped above were forced to make impossible choices as the fire spread. Some left the windows rather than be overtaken by the flames. One moment was remembered by witnesses for years afterward. On the 9th floor, a young man helped others reach the window before remaining behind himself. What followed was never fully documented, and none of those involved were ever identified. By approximately 5:05, the fire had claimed its final victims. Firefighters extinguished the flames on all 3 affected floors by 5:15. The fire lasted only 18 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the city moved on, and the story moved from the street to the courtroom. For a moment, it looked like justice might follow. A grand jury indicted Max Blank and Isaac Harris on 7 counts of second-degree manslaughter on April 11, 1911, just 17 days after the fire, and the charges focused specifically on Margaret Schwartz's death at the locked Washington Place door. The trial ran from December 4th through December 27, 1911, and factory owners retained none other than defense attorney Max D. Stuer, one of the era's most celebrated lawyers. If the victims wanted any justice at all, they were going to have to win here. Physical evidence sat in their favor. The door handle from the 9th floor, found with the bolt in a locked position, and witness testimony from multiple survivors who swore they couldn't open the door, that they'd twisted and pulled desperately while smoke filled their lungs and fire approached. Kate Alterman, a key witness and survivor, gave testimony that she saw Margaret Schwartz die trying to open that door. Stoyer reframed the case entirely. Stoyer's strategy was devastating. He had Alterman repeat her testimony multiple times. She repeated it almost word for word, and Stoyer argued this proved she'd been coached, that her testimony was rehearsed and therefore unreliable. The truth was simpler and more heartbreaking. Alterman had practiced her testimony repeatedly because English was her second language, and she was terrified of making mistakes that would let the owners escape justice. As things never go according to plan, a legal technicality comes up. Judge Thomas C.T. Crane instructs the jury that the prosecution had to prove the owners personally knew the door was locked at that specific moment during the fire. Not that they had a policy of locking it, not that they usually locked it, but that they knew it was locked right then. Everyone in the courtroom froze. The tension was unmistakable. Now, the burden of proof was on the victims. 1 hour and 45 minutes. That's how long the jury deliberated. On December 27, 1911, they returned a not guilty verdict, and the courtroom erupted. Blank and Harris had to be smuggled out through the judge's chambers with police escort while crowds outside screamed, "Murderers!" David Weiner, whose sister Rose died in the fire, rushed at the owners, shouting these words, "Murderers! Murderers! You are acquitted now, but we will get you yet." The acquittal was only the first insult. The insurance payouts revealed the grotesque economic reality of the Triangle fire, and the numbers tell the story better than anything else could. Blank and Harris collected approximately $64,925 more than their documented losses from insurance companies, which worked out to roughly $400 to $445 per dead worker. Families of the victims sued for compensation, and the civil lawsuits dragged on for 3 years before finally settling on March 11, 1914. $75 per deceased victim. That's what the families received. The owners profited financially from the deaths of their employees. What followed showed that the verdict had taught them nothing. Max Blank was arrested again in August 1913, and less than 2 years after 146 workers died behind locked doors, for locking exit doors during working hours at a new factory. $20. That was his fine. Both owners were caught in 1914 sewing fraudulent labels into garments falsely claiming the clothes were made under sound, fair conditions, and they closed the Triangle Company in 1918. When the legal system failed to deliver justice and insurance companies profited from negligence, the response did not come from the courts. It came from the streets. Unions and workers, who had long warned that catastrophe was inevitable, watched their fears become reality. Public outrage was swift and overwhelming, and this time it did not fade. The verdict may have closed the courtroom, but it cracked open the public conscience. To many Americans, the fire no longer looked like an accident. It looked like a betrayal. Rose Schneiderman was one of them. A 4'9" Polish-born Jewish labor organizer who'd led Triangle workers during the 1909 strike, and on April 2, 1911, she spoke at a memorial meeting at the Metropolitan Opera House. Her speech became one of the most famous in American labor history. "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you good people of the public, and we have found you wanting." Her message was clear. If workers wanted better conditions, they were going to have to save themselves because no one was coming to help them. The old Inquisition had its rack and its thumbscrews and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. We know what these things are today. The iron teeth are our necessities. The thumbscrews are the high-powered and swift machinery close to which we must work. And the rack is here in the fire trap structures that will destroy us the minute they catch on fire. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. Schneiderman's words were not a call for sympathy, they were a challenge. And unlike so many moments of public mourning, this one did not end in silence. The pressure she and other labor activists exerted transformed grief into political urgency, forcing the state to confront conditions it could no longer ignore. The New York State Legislature established the Factory Investigating Commission on June 30, 1911, chaired by State Senator Robert Wagner, with Assemblyman Alfred Smith as vice chairman, while Rose Schneiderman became an inspector. The commission got to work immediately. It conducted the most extensive investigation of working conditions in American history. They called 222 witnesses, inspected 1,836 industries, and compiled 3,000 pages of testimony in the first year alone. 7 months after the fire, in October 1911, the Sullivan-Hoey fire prevention law passed. It required sprinkler systems, established the New York City Fire Prevention Bureau, mandated that doors open outward and remain unlocked during working hours, and made fire drills mandatory. More than 30 new labor laws had been enacted in New York by 1914. By 1915, 36 laws directly from the Commission's recommendations became law, covering fire safety, ventilation, sanitation, working hours for women and children, and machine guarding. The American Society of Safety Professionals was founded on October 14, 1911, just months after the fire as a direct response to Triangle, and the National Safety Council followed in 1913. The changes that followed were neither symbolic nor temporary. Safety became institutionalized, written into law, and embedded into the fabric of American labor. What had been treated as unavoidable risk was finally recognized as preventable harm, and responsibility shifted, however imperfectly, from workers to employers and the state. The American Society of Safety Professionals was founded on October 14, 1911, just months after the fire as a direct response to Triangle, and the National Safety Council followed in 1913. The New York Labor Code became the model for the nation. But history is not preserved by institutions alone. It lives in the people who survived, and in the voices that refused to fade. Rose Friedman was 2 days shy of her 18th birthday on March 25, 1911, and she escaped Triangle by following executives to the roof. She became a lifelong union supporter and spoke at a garment workers' rally in Los Angeles at age 104. February 15, 2001. That's when she died at age 107 in Beverly Hills, California, the last known survivor of the fire. Reporter William Shepard ended his eyewitness account, published March 27, 1911, with these words, "The floods of water from the fireman's hose that ran into the gutter were actually stained red with blood. I looked upon the heap of dead bodies, and I remembered these girls were the shirtwaist makers. I remembered their great strike of last year in which these same girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in the shops. These dead bodies were the answer. Margaret Schwartz died trying to escape through a locked door. Kate Leone died at 14. Rosaria Maltese died at 14. 146 workers died in 18 minutes because a $5,000 sprinkler system was too expensive and locked doors were more convenient than worker safety until their deaths forced America to change. The workplace protections we take for granted today exist because 146 people died when they shouldn't have, and because the witnesses refused to let those deaths be meaningless.